Welcome to the Online Great Books podcast, brought to you by OnlineGreatBooks.com, where we talk about the good life, the great books, great conversation, and great ideas. I'm Scott Hambrick.
And I'm Karl Shute.
And today we are going to talk about King John the Bad's Magna Carta.
Magna Carta is how I say it.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that. But before we do that, please, guys, read along with us. I was doing an orientation last night, Karl, for some new Online Great Books members. Mm-hmm. And I said, any questions you guys have at all? I've talked to everything I want to talk about. Any questions? And the guy raised his hand. He said, how do I know what you guys are reading for the next show? And I said, well, we always say that at the end. He's like, oops, I'm busted. I said, well, Karl said we needed to put it at the beginning. Next show is going to be probably the next two shows. It's going to be Frank Herbert's Dune.
Yeah, I have to get busy because I'm only 180 pages through my rereading.
So I say, hey, Karl, let's read Walden. It's 325 or something like that. Okay. Karl says, let's read Lord of the Rings trilogy, The Gulag Archipelago, and Dune.
Well, you know what we're going to do after Dune?
What?
We're going to do Les Mis and War and Peace.
Oh, my Lord.
Saddle up.
I have never read a word of Tolstoy.
I've read half of it. I'm still reading it. It's been 20 years.
Yeah.
It's just taken me a while. I have a bookmark in it and everything.
Hey, I would like to suggest one for after Dune, though, for anybody that wants to get ahead. What do you think about a little Arthur Schopenhauer, Metaphysics of Love?
Is it 1,000 pages?
It's an essay.
Let's do it.
I've not read it. I was just looking through a little Schopenhauer. This title came up. I've never read it. I don't know a thing about it. It could be utterly insane. But I was like, it's Schopenhauer. It's got an awesome title, and it's not very long.
That's good.
I've also been thinking we should read a little Yukio Mishima.
Mishima.
The Sound of Waves.
Which one is that? The Sound of Waves. Have you read it yet?
I have not, but that's why I want to read it for the show, because I want to read it anyway. And this show crowds out anything. It crowds out all joy in my life.
Yeah, so the subtitle of the Online Great Books podcast is going to be Karl and Scott's Leisure Reading.
Right.
Eventually. They're just going to meld. The Venn diagram's going to collapse into a Venn circle. You know, books that we're reading, books we talk about.
Yukio Mishima. That's just fun to say. What do you think? Metaphysics of Love, Schopenhauer?
Let me know the edition you're using so I can get the same one.
I got it out of that University of Adelaide library, so if the dear listener would like to follow along. And it's a shorty. So you can go, a couple bathroom sessions. You'll have that one done.
My bathroom sessions are quick.
Well, you'll have to just read faster. Last week, we did the Articles of Confederation, for good or for bad. And this week, we're going to read the Great Charter, the Magna Carta of... What was it? 1247. Karl said, you're going to have to be the history guy on this. I don't want to do the history part.
1215.
1215.
Yeah.
King John Lackland, he was not the oldest child.
No.
They called him Lackland because he didn't have any land. He didn't inherit any lands. And by hook or by crook, he ended up being king for a time. Richard the Lionheart split. He had to go and do some crusading business and left John. And John was not a good leader. He ultimately lost Normandy for us.
For us?
For us, you said.
Us? Mm-hmm. Excuse me?
To the French. Look, There's the French, and then there's all the rest of us. And was subjecting the people to atrocity. Particularly his barons and his other nobles were outraged at his behavior, his taxing, his court system, and a whole bunch of stuff. And they cornered this cat at Runnymede, and they made him sign this.
Yeah, they didn't chop his head off. That happens later. They just made him sign it. Some background on King John. Now, parentheses. All right. Magna Carta is a historical document from 1215 that maybe it was never really enforced, but it's had an influence. And you can look at something like this, dear listener, and think, I can't possibly get into this. I need a whole bunch of commentary. I need to get some history PhDs to tell me what I should think about it. Like, I can't even keep track of the Plantagenet family, so maybe I shouldn't read it. And I say, nuts to that. Read it. You can figure out stuff from it. All of those other people read it once too.
Right.
There's this temptation not to read stuff because you don't have the expert. So just dive into it. There's some fun stuff about John. John is the king from, if you've seen the Robin Hood cartoon, the Disney one, that's King John, Sheriff of Nottingham. This is King John. His dad, so Henry II, Peter O'Toole played him twice in Becket, which has a great excommunication scene. I always wanted to do that, like excommunicate somebody with the candles and everything. If you haven't seen the movie, it's marvelous. And he played Henry II again with, I think, Katharine Hepburn as Eleanor of Aquitaine. I think they had 4 boys: Henry, Richard, Geoffrey, John, and John is the youngest. And every one of them died.
Right.
Except John.
Bad King John.
But I was just checking up a little bit of the background on this, and they were fighting wars against each other and against their dad, just wars all the time. This is a crazy family.
It's only 150 years out from Battle of Hastings, by the way.
Right.
There's no more distance between this and that than there is from us and the Civil War, the American Civil War, for example.
Yeah, so they're just kind of figuring out how to be kings of England and establish a stable, rather than being, descendants of, they are descendants of Vikings by way of France, coming over and taking over this island, and now they've got to figure out how to be whatever it is they're going to be.
They're sorting out feudalism.
Yeah, and so they cornered him at Runnymede, and they made him sign this document. So what is this document, Scott?
Extortion.
Extortion?
Well, they're extorting some rights out of the king. It's a primordial constitution, right? There are all kinds of little phrases in here and all kinds of ideas in here you're going to recognize from our modern constitutions. And most of the stuff in here, though, has been overturned by Parliament. And there are only just a few little chunks of it that are still in force. But there are a bunch of things in here that you're going to recognize. In fact, it's so important to the founding of our country that there is a copy of it in the National Archives that I think Churchill gave us.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yep. I think there were 12 copies made at Runnymede, and there are some other copies that are subsequent to that that came up. And I think the one that they have at the National Archives is like the 1247 one or something like that. It's one of the early ones. Supposedly, John executed this thing, meaning he signed it and held to it for about a year before he proceeded to overturn it or to ignore it. And then
he died of dysentery.
Yep. Clean living. But it starts off with a preamble, which is really just a greeting to everyone. And it's written as though John wrote this, but these earls and dukes and so on penned this and made him sign it. It's my understanding. The first part's a greeting where he greets all of his bishops, abbots, earls, barons, justiciaries, foresters, sheriffs, stewards, servants, and to all bailiffs and liege subjects. Greetings. And then he greets the church, and then he greets all of the earls, and he names those. You're going to recognize some of these names of these earls. There's the Marshalls, the Pembrokes, the Salisburys, Alan of Galloway, Fitzgerald, Fitzherbert, Hubert de Burgh, so on.
Related to Cab of Calloway?
Cab and the Duke of Ellington. Then we get down to business. Number one, right off the bat, John promises to grant freedom to the English church. The church shall have her rights entire and her liberties inviolate. And of course, at this time, this is pre-Henry VIII. This is Reformation.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the Catholic Church.
Yeah, merry old England. This is before whatever happened with Henry VIII, which is complicated.
The unfortunate business. What do you call it, Karl?
What do I call the Reformation?
Yeah. Because in the South, you've got the unfortunate business and the lost cause, and they won't call it the Civil War. So what do you call it?
Oh, we call it the Reformation, but
you do. Okay.
The great rise of heresy.
Right. Yeah.
My friend Jacob and I go over this sometimes. He's a online coaching client and an online great books client, and whenever I have to be careful if I ever complain about my church. Mm-hmm. He'll just pop up and say, well, there was a gentleman named Martin Luther that had similar complaints, and then he's rattling off to me the Confession of Augsburg or something. Right. And I'm like, well played, Jacob.
Yeah, gross.
So people of conscience came down on all sides on that issue. So that's a complicated thing. But this is before, and I think it's important for government in general.
He's got a separation of church and state here.
Exactly. The church is going to be free from the state. And what this means probably is that the church gets to elect the bishops for the most part, that the clergy are free from civil courts, that you can't just get the church to do whatever you want. It's not a state church. Eventually it becomes a state church, but it's not. This is, how many years is this from Becket being murdered?
Oh, I don't know my Becket dates.
Well, Becket was his dad. So Henry II got into a fight with St. Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury. He's a saint, depending on your point of view.
1170.
The Canterbury Tales is people on the way to visit the shrine of the guy that died fighting his dad over the rights of the church. My kids were having this discussion because they participate in some online Great Books programs that aren't ours. And there's some earnest young folk on the forums that will say things like, well, they're mostly Catholics in this group, but they'll say things like, well, it would be great if the government were Catholic. And I'm like, no. It would be great if the people in government were religious,
But not the government itself, right?
But I want a separation. If the two become close, what can happen? It's one source rule.
We confuse our final causes.
Sure. I don't want to get too much inside baseball here, if you're not a churchy person, but think about it this way. If you do not have an independent something in your state that can stand up to what the government says, you're in trouble, I think.
Mm-hmm.
If you have one source rule, I think you're in trouble. And maybe you don't like the church. Maybe if you were in 1215, you'd be like, maybe you'd go to church on Sunday so everybody would see you there, and then you'd go back to your house and grumble. Okay, fine, go grumble. But it's good that there is a church that can be in opposition to the king, rather than having the king be able to make everything in the state be his.
So it's a check and balance, you say?
I do say.
Yeah, I think so. Oh, by the way, talking about this government stuff, Karl, we had a review, an iTunes review. I thought this was interesting. Very pleasant, but one problem, it says. I want to start out by saying that this is an insightful podcast, and it does our civilization a great service in what it promotes. Oh, my only gripe is that the first episode I listened to, there seemed to be a dismissal of voting. both the host and both for the host and essentially for the individual too. The basis was essentially that it's not worth the time, that we lack the insight to vote. Beyond that, the acquisition of information to make informed decision is not worth the trouble.
I believe that was your position.
I don't think that's exactly a fair reading, but it's not that it's not worth the trouble. I don't kid myself that I can be informed on all the issues. And I don't kid myself. I never cast a vote for one of these weird judges' seats when I don't know who the people are. I think it's unethical to do it. We'll go. I'll go vote in November here, and there'll be a bunch of like these judges' seats and all kinds of stuff on there that I'd really know nothing about. And I don't know anything about wastewater treatment plants, and I'm supposed to vote for bond elections for those things, and I just don't know how to do it. I'm not a civil engineer. I don't know. Anyway, so government, it keeps coming up.
We have made democracy into a hypostasized thing that we have to defend. Mm-hmm. Well, if I were going to say what's the key feature of that culture we share, and the one that we read about in online great books, it's that we refer back to ourselves and criticize ourselves. Okay? So, is democracy a good thing? You ought to be able to defend it. And if so, how good? And you make some distinctions. Are there any limits on it? Are there things that I think it was Cleon and the other guy, I always forget his name, in Thucydides, arguing over whether they should send a ship to this island that had revolted and kill them all. And the one guy says, none of you people can really know this stuff. It's up to the orators who present the things to you and present to you the things you can vote on. How much of world events can you know? So if democracy is in fact a good thing, and I think it is actually, but you want to think, what are its limits? What's the scope? We haven't read the Constitution here yet, but our own Constitution did not envision everybody voting on everything.
Yeah.
And that might not be the greatest thing.
2.
I'm sorry, that was a divergent.
No, I think that's true. The voting is oppressive. 2. If any of our earls or barons or other holding of us in chief by military service shall have died. So if any of their nobles die in military service, it sets up some rules for what happens to their properties and what is given to their heirs and so on. I can just imagine. I didn't go to any secondary sources here because we don't do that. We don't let people mediate this for us until we read it at least once. This reads like the king was confiscating people's property who had died in his military service.
Yeah, so the end of the paragraph is, whoever owes less, let him give less according to the ancient custom of fiefs. So the ancient custom, rather than the newfangled stuff that John had been doing. Yeah. You have changed you've changed the game, and that's not fair, and we want to go back.
Yeah. Number 3, he just says, if you're one of the heirs and you're in wardship, you can still have your inheritance and without fine. When you come of age. So these underage people were inheriting things from their dead parents. He was taxing them immediately, apparently, but now he says that they have no fines or any of that stuff until they hit their majority. More stuff about guardianship of these heirs. So it says in here, the guardian, so long as he has the wardship of the land, shall keep up the houses, parks, fish ponds, stanks, mills and other things pertaining to the land out of the issues of the same land, and shall restore to their heir. So this is some trust law, that it says that the guardians that have to of inheritances of minor children and ladies, frankly, have to take care of that which they're entrusted with, and that they have to do it from the proceeds of the properties. Well,
and it's protection of keeping in mind that this is for barons. This is not for everybody. Not everybody's got fish ponds and stanks, whatever stanks are. I forget what.
I had to look that up. That's a small still pond.
A small still pond, a stank. Mm-hmm. Are there any stanks on your new
There
property?
Is a stank. There is a stank.
Does it stink? And are the two words related?
I'm sure they are. A small still pond could become stagnant and stank.
We say stink.
Right. Stink, stank, stunk.
People die a lot. People leave children that are not of age to give the military service and be the full rank that their father was. And so they would be a ward to somebody else. Well, this might be your lucky day. If you become the ward of someone, that someone can take all your property and sell it. The law here is that you have to deliver it intact, fundamentally intact, and wealth here is mostly land and stuff. It's not like cash in the bank. You have to deliver the land to the younger generation intact. You can't just do whatever you want with it.
You can't steal what you're entrusted with. Fiduciary duty.
Which is nice, and you think, well, that's obvious. But it's not obvious. It has to be carved out, It has to be carved out of law. Civilization takes a little work, In the forest primeval, we were not taking care of the wards.
More about heirs. Heirs shall be married without disparagement, yet so that before the marriage takes place, the nearest in blood to that heir shall have notice. Widows, stuff about widows there in number 7. Here's number 8. I like this. No widow shall be compelled to marry so long as she prefers to live without a husband, provided always that she gives security not to marry without our consent. If she holds of us, or without the consent of the lord of whom she holds, if she holds of another.
So she doesn't have to get married again. Well, a marriage was also a political act. This is not marriage for love necessarily. Probably not very often, actually. But if she's happy being unmarried and widowed, she can stay that way. But if she's going to get married, then she needs to contact the king or whoever is responsible for her.
Yeah, so you can imagine that the king could potentially make widows who had inherited property or were encumbered with property marry one of his allies, essentially just give them that property.
Well, and you said it, he could make widows.
Well, and he can make widows, yeah.
And then he can make the widows marry people that he wanted them to marry.
Yeah.
And thus get property for the state, right? And this is that one source theory that I don't like. This is the conglomeration of everything, and the Magna Carta is a response against that, saying no to the one source state. I like number 9. Neither we nor our bailiffs shall seize any land or rent for any debt so long as the chattels of the debt are sufficient to repay the debt. So you can't go for the land first.
You can auction their cattle or other properties, small tools and implements, we would say, but you can't take the land first.
Yeah, which is, again, it's a limit on the land grab. There's restrictions on usury.
I like this. Number 10, in merry old England, the moneylenders are all Jewish people.
Yeah, because they were the only ones allowed to charge interest.
Yep.
So
they're loaning at interest, and here it says if someone die before their loan is repaid, the loan still has to be repaid, but it can't accrue interest again until the kid becomes an adult.
Right, which makes sense because the kid can't earn any money.
The kid can't earn any money, and whatever money is being made by the property needs to go to the care and feeding of the child and their guardian. Like taking care of kids is a full-time job. So you got to feed the guardian and the kids and everything. And then when the kid's an adult, the kid can pay the interest off. Number 11 is pretty much the same thing, but about wives.
I really like 12. My notes are multicolored on that one so that I would notice. Not exactly sure what a scutage is, but I think it's some kind of debt. No scutage nor aid shall be imposed on our kingdom unless by common counsel of our kingdom, except for ransoming our person for making our eldest son a knight and for once marrying our eldest daughter. You have to think about what that means or what it seems to mean.
I had to look it up. Scutage.
Yeah, what is a scutage?
A tax sort of levied on knights. They could pay that, and they'll talk about this again here later. They could pay it in cash or they could pay it in military service. This is feudalism, right? You get military protection from your lord and you kick upstairs to him. And the way the lord provides military service is he has an army or the ability to raise one, and he has fortifications, and that has to be done somehow. And anyway, that's scutage. That's what that one was.
Yeah, I just rang a bell with me. So the Latin word scuta means shield. So if you're able to give military service, means you have a shield. So what I wrote down is this is the no taxation without representation clause.
Yep.
You can't charge this without common counsel. Well, who's he going to get counsel from? I guess Parliament or the Council of Barons.
And there's only a House of Lords at this point. Parliament is just the Lords, if I'm not mistaken. There is no House of Commons.
So this is a big deal that otherwise, the one source government can just, well, we're going to raise your taxes. Okay, great. And that's all you can say rather than, hey, wait a minute. At least you have to get the permission or counsel of these people before you do it. Otherwise, what if John just has gambling debts he needs to pay off?
Scutage.
He met some woman in Paris while he was off visiting Philip, and now he's got to pay her money. Did you know he had 2 wives named Isabel?
I saw that.
That was convenient for him.
I have an uncle who married 2 Carols in succession.
He didn't have to change that bit of his mind.
Right.
Hey, Carol.
He didn't have a tattoo with her name, but if he did, it would stand. It would be fine. If you're in the throes of anger, you don't call him by the other name. It's great. And in mine it says, and the city of London shall have all its ancient liberties and free customs, as well by land as by water. Furthermore, we decree and grant that all other cities, boroughs, towns, and ports shall have all their liberties and free customs. City is in lowercase. They got the city of London, which is its own thing and is different than the town of London or the metropolis of London. I wonder if that's what this is. I mean, is this just, at this point, it just would have been a small walled port city on the Thames,
Well, I bet it was the biggest city at this time. I haven't checked the population. I know 1300's population was pretty high in Europe. I don't know about 1200's. When I studied the Black Death long ago for a paper, the book written sometime in the 70s asserted that there were spots in Europe that still don't have the population density they had before the plague. So that shows they were doing well. So I don't know what London was like. But what I like about this, what I like about it, is the primacy of ancient rights. So each little township had their way of doing things. That's the way I would think of it. We have townships, which, depending on your state, have certain rights that the state doesn't have. And this charter is recognizing them. So London has their way of doing things, their ancient liberties and free customs, and they get to do the thing the way that they have it. Like they have the mayor of London, which has his own customs. Lord Mayor. Yeah, the Lord Mayor. And maybe the town of East Anglia has, I don't know if that's a town, Colchester or something, has its own way of doing it. And they get to keep it. So once again, you have another source versus the king. You have the king, and then you have all these little sources of sovereignty that get to keep their sovereignty, keeping Leviathan small.
Yes.
And dependent on its...
Is this a states' rights issue?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's cities' rights. They didn't have states. Civitates. I think we have the same translation, by the way.
Yeah. You talked about East Anglia. That wasn't a city. But my oldest daughter, when we talk about a hypothetical English town, she has named her hypothetical English town. It's Brindleshire.
Say that again?
Brindleshire.
Brindleshire. Yes. And what is Brindleshire like?
Well, it's in the Midlands. Everybody has sort of a neutral English accent, and it's about 40% agricultural, and part of the old wall is still there. Like she could tell you about it.
Which daughter is this?
Riley.
My son has a world that he's worked out. It's called Block World. Although he started this when he was very young, so it's Block World. But he has to make pains to tell you now that although it is named Block World, the people are not in fact made of blocks. It's just a coincidence from the origin story. And he's got an origin story that goes back thousands of years for why it's called Block World. But they're not actual blocks. He has to be careful about that.
Right.
Rather than change the name, he's going to keep the name Block World. Just come up with a reason why. Do you think our listeners are interested in the weirdness of our children?
I hope so. I hope your kids are weirder.
Oh, they're so weird. They're
Good
so
listener.
weird.
Is there more about scutage? They're in number 14. I wasn't riveted by 14.
Well, it gives some rules for for Parliament. It gives some general rules. For obtaining the Common Council, you have to summon the archbishops, bishops, abbots, earls, greater barons. You have to give them letters. You have to tell them when, and then it's going to be at a particular place in 40 days. In other words, it has to be published. So a contemporary of John's, a later contemporary, almost a contemporary of John's, Thomas Aquinas talks about law. It's an ordinance of reason for the common good by him who has authority. But there's another word in there. It has to be promulgated.
The promulgation's important.
I was thinking about this when you talked about the 12 copies that were made at Runnymede. For us, on February 27th of 2020, which is when we're recording this, promulgation is an afterthought. You put it up on the server and it promulgates. And in theory, now it's available and everyone can read it, and you go to your congressman's website and see things. But it wasn't so easy then. No one would know what happened in Runnymede.
Right.
You have to get 12 copies, and then what did you do with the copies? You have to take them to public places in England where everybody walks or rides a horse. Okay? And then you have to see it. Like the laws of Hammurabi. We have a copy somewhere in Chicago in the Oriental Institute, I believe, for the University of Chicago. There's a copy of the Code of Hammurabi. It's this huge stone with it carved onto it, which was set up in the town so that people could go read what the laws were. I think the Romans had the 12 tablets.
If you don't write a law, does it exist?
No. No, if a tree falls in a forest and nobody's there to hear it, well, it might make a sound. But if a law is made in a forest and there's nobody there to read it, it's not a law.
No, it's just wackadoo fiat.
That's like my secret rules for poker.
Yeah, it's whim. I like that.
My secret unpromulgated rules of poker, which is I win.
I like that.
And it needs to be unchanging too, right? It needs to be the promulgation.
It literally sets it in stone.
Yeah, or sets it on parchment. That means that the law is somehow stable. Promulgating it, now you have witnesses to what the law was. King John can't say, no, that's not what I signed. Yeah, it is. We have a copy. Now you're bound to it.
Because again, the civilization stuff takes a little business, takes a little work.
Yeah.
It didn't just pop up out of the dirt.
Nope.
The next one says, you can't just say that someone can charge people who were free tenants before rent all of a sudden. Yes, there are starting to be smallholders, yeomen here, free tenants who had some claim on the property and didn't need to rent. And I guess John had been taking people who were free tenants and suddenly just charging them rent. You don't really own it anymore. You're not a free tenant. You're not a freeholder. The rent is X. Wait a minute.
Congratulations, you're a serf.
30 years. My old man paid this place off. No. So he makes that go away.
Yeah. I liked 17 about the court system. Common pleas shall not follow our court, but shall be held in some fixed place. The king would travel around. Well, I will hold court at Westminster this summer, and then I shall hold court. And, the king would move around, because you'd have, if you think of governments as, the mechanism of government is the projection of power. In a society where you have to walk around to project your power. And so the king has to be walking through his domain, can't just sit in the capital. So the court would follow. But now the court's going to be in a particular place.
Yeah, common pleas. So I wonder if this is kind of like small claims.
Isn't this the court of assizes? This is like English money. When they start talking about their court system, right. my mind just blanks out, where they're going to establish, how many pence it costs to hunt on the king's property.
A friend of the show, David Crowther, who has the History of English podcast.
Marvelous podcast.
It's a really great podcast. He did a show one time, a couple years ago, about these roaming courts. And the king would send a courier and he'd say, hey, Baron or Earl Shute, we're going to come and stay at your place for a while. And the king would just show up with his whole retinue. It might be a staff of maybe hundreds. And you would just have to put them up, feed them, wine and dine, in your facilities there. And it would just ruin people.
Yeah. I'm going to reference popular culture right now. So,
okay,
Scott, if you want to mute me for a moment.
I'll take a nap.
So in the show, the recently popular show, Game of Thrones, everything that's best about Game of Thrones is just medieval history with dragons and a tiny bit of magic that's never quite explained because what's-his-name never finished the book. What's it? Martin? George R.R. Martin?
Yeah. R.R. Karl R.R.
Yeah.
If you write
you need the double R, like J.R.R. Tolkien, right? So in the beginning, if you watch the first season or read the first book, the king shows up at the Stark's castle at Winterfell. He just announces, I'm coming. And now they have to get ready for the king and all of his entourage, and it causes problems and sets in the whole action of the show. But that's historical.
Yep.
That sort of thing, where the king just shows up and says, I'm going to be here. You better put me up. In our Declaration of Independence, one of the complaints was against the quartering of troops. Mm-hmm. This is similar to that. The king would just say, I'm putting my people in your house.
Some nobles would want them there. You'd have the more access to the king than others for at least that time, but it could cause them severe financial distress. 18 has several words in it that I don't know. So I just thought, we're getting started, dear listener, on work for our sister podcast, the Music and Ideas podcast. So I have a new technological tool here that I can use right now. There are some words in this one. Inquest of novel, Disseissin. I have no idea what that is. But I looked it up in the Oxford English Dictionary subscription that I got at onlinegreatbooks.com. And listen, Karl.
Oh, cool.
Disseissin. I looked that up. It's the act or fact of disseising. It's a wrongful dispossession of lands. Inquest of novel disposition of lands, of death of ancestors, and of, here's another one, Darrein. There are so many old, archaic legal terms in here that don't really have translations. It's a little tough. Let's see if we can find a pronunciation of this thing. Darrein. Holy smoke. The Oxford English Dictionary doesn't have a pronunciation of this word.
Oh, no. But does it have a definition?
It's so freaking old, nobody knows what it sounds like. Last, ultimate, final is what that means.
Okay.
So in quest of novel disseisin of mort de
Disseisin? No, whatever. De ancestor. Just say it in French. I have the Latin. De morte antecesoris.
Okay.
That sounded Italian.
So,
it's like church Latin.
And of this durine word shall not be held anywhere other than their own county courts. So seizing lands, assessing ecclesiastical benefits, that's what that durine presentment means. All that stuff has to be local. It has to be in your county court.
I like that.
You bet. You know, we still have some baloney like this. I've got a friend who owns a business, and some people owe him money. And he's here in Oklahoma. And this company that owes him money has offices in New York City. They're spending a lot of money, the two parties involved in the collections operation, to figure out where to go to court in the state of Oklahoma courts or state of New York courts.
What do they call that? Choice of venue?
Choice of venue.
Yeah. Venue shopping.
They had a pretty plain vanilla arrangement between the two companies, and it was under the Uniform Commercial Code, but some of it's taking place on the internet. I guess it's not exactly clear where you hear collections actions nowadays. If you both live in Tulsa County and the radiator shop owes you money and you have to go to collect it, that's clear where you go. You go to Tulsa County Courthouse. But before they wrote this, nobody knew.
Well, I would say it's getting more complicated now with that internet thing, which is probably going to catch on. Like, if you want to record a phone call, depends what state you're in. If you're in a one-party consent state, you can record whatever you want. If you're in a two-party consent state, you have to get both parties' consent. You need to know what the law is if you're going to record your calls.
More about court venues, blah, blah, blah. All this seems sort of pedestrian to us, but this was innovative. That's why this thing's so darn important. I don't think, was there anything else like it? Was there one of these that the Franks had, or that they had in Saxony in Germany or anything? I don't think so.
Other people had law codes, that's for sure. So there are plenty of law codes. This is not too long after this whole island had been conquered by foreigners. Okay, so the kings and a bunch of the nobles are Frenchmen who used to be Vikings, imposing new will. Like, one of the first things William the Conqueror did was the taxation book, right? The Doomsday Book, to figure out how much everybody owes. So you have a new sheriff in town, sort of. A sheriff is a person in charge of a shire.
Yeah, isn't that funny?
By the way.
It used to be a shire reeve.
A shire reeve? Yeah. Nottingham had one, didn't they? So you have to work all this stuff out. If you have arrived on the shores in the Battle of Hastings and you win the battle, and was it King Alfred that you kill, whoever it was that you killed, the previous king of the old ways, and now you have power, you can do whatever you want because you have the most power.
Yep.
And you probably did.
And I think to the Normans, England was probably a third world country. Backwards, stupid.
They spoke a funny language. They didn't speak French.
Right.
So establishing these ancient customs, we want what we had under Alfred. It was Alfred, right?
Yeah.
I'm not screwing up my Saxon kings. We want to have the old ways. We want to have our old privileges. And we don't want you to completely wipe everything away for the sake of the newfangled Norman gentry. This stuff takes work. So there's this, we've said this a few times, people seem to think that civilization arises right out of the soil. You know, you just water the soil and up pops a civilization, complete with laws and good behavior. And no, it had to be worked for. Everything that you enjoy, wherever you live, that you can count on, has taken some work. I was driving up through Chicago the other day on my way to the gym where I coach people in the meat world, just riding on these enormous highways. And I didn't almost drive off the road, but I was just struck with awe because they're rebuilding one of our highways, and they're going to move the thing over. They're building an enormous bridge that goes across the Des Plaines River Valley. And I've seen them delivering the I-beams for this thing. And it's an immense engineering project. All of this stuff takes a stable civilization. It takes people who know how to do it. It takes sourcing the materials. It's just to have a road that nobody's going to think twice about, except me. It takes a whole lot of work to get to the point where you can have a road or running water or a court system that you can trust even a little bit.
Even a little bit. It was Harold, by the way. I just looked it up.
At the Battle of Hastings?
Yeah.
I messed it up. I'm so sorry. I messed something else up. A member pointed it out to me. The Michelangelo is not in the Vatican.
No, we say a lot of things off the top of our head here.
I'm sorry.
Back to that bridge thing. You're talking about the I-beams and just how difficult it is to make a road. I'm going to put in a culvert to put in a driveway. So the county has to tell you how big the culvert needs to be. Because if you don't put in one big enough, you'll mess up the drainage. So they know, they've done studies, and they know how much drainage is going to keep coming down that ditch and how big the culvert needs to be. That's not nothing, man. If you get that wrong, the road floods and washes out and people can't get down the road. The culvert has to be right. And it took a lot of people a lot of years to figure out how to size those things. So then I went and bought a culvert. Actually, I bought two. I bought two 30-foot culverts. One is corrugated steel. It's galvanized. So I figured out how to hook electrodes to it and dip it in zinc. It's amazing. And then the other one's just a piece of steel pipe. It's 30 feet long, 12 inches diameter, quarter-inch wall, $715. But those I-beams, holy crap, they're expensive, man. They're building that bridge with.
I'm not 6 feet tall, but we can round up. These things are probably twice as tall as me.
Yeah, huge.
They're going to put them on a big pylon of concrete. They already have the pylons up. It's like, you go and you look at the pyramid in Egypt. This is more impressive than the pyramid.
Yeah. Those I-beams could be $100,000 a piece, maybe more. Support the weight of 8, 10, 12 semi-trucks at once. It's crazy.
And you don't get there if you don't have Magna Carta.
No. Speaking of bridges and things and overpasses, 23, no village or individual should be compelled to make bridges at riverbanks except those from old were legally bound to do so. So he's not going to, the king can't just point at you and say, hey, out of your own pocket, build a bridge for us right there. Can you imagine?
Bridge extortion.
Yeah, the city comes to you, knocks on the door. You got to put in a storm drain for the neighborhood right now. Bankrupt you.
Yeah.
Apparently that's what he was doing.
Yeah, well, there's questions of who was responsible for different things. I was just thinking that the troll lobby probably had something to do with this.
Right.
That, we had a thing in front of our house. We had a flood in our house where I was sitting, right where I'm sitting right now, and water started dripping down on me. My daughter was taking a shower, and the drains backed up. And the reason why was because a certain cable company, a very large cable company, had drilled their cable right through our pipe. Mm-hmm. Their cable was inside our sewer pipe, and the debris had gotten in it. It finally clogged up, and it took us a whole lot of work and to find out who was responsible for the screw up and who had to fix it. Was it me? Because it was my pipe. The first answer I got, it was my responsibility because it's my sanitary sewer pipe. Except I didn't screw it up, and then trying to find out who screwed it up, and the cable company subcontracted, so you had to find the subcontractor, and they didn't want to do it, so you had to get the city involved to tell them that they had to do it. It was a huge mess. When something breaks, who's responsible for it? And so this is not small potato stuff, Magna Carta setting out who's responsible for the bridges. If you want a bridge, you make it.
So much of this thing is about property. 30, 31, 32, 33. The sheriff or bailiff can't take your carts and horses. The bailiff can't just show up and take all your wood.
Right? You missed the rent control one.
Oh, well, yeah, that's in there too. 32, if someone's been convicted of a felony, the king can't keep their lands forever. I guess he could just convict you of a felony and just take your land. But he can't do that anymore. All caedels for the future shall be removed altogether from the Thames and the Medway and throughout England, except on the seashore. Had to look that one up. Fish traps.
Yep. A navigation obstacle. So here you get...
Oh, is that the way you read it? I read it that people were catching everybody else's fish.
I mean, how are you going to travel the river if you're going to be running into everybody's trap?
Sure.
And that seems to me like this is a reasonable job for a federal government. The government of John is to make sure that the waterways are clear You know, he has a similar thing in here somewhere about, I think at 35, we're talking about measures. I love the non-metric system measures.
I know.
But 35 is about let there be one measure of wine throughout our whole realm, one measure of ale, one measure of corn, to wit the London quarter, one width of cloth, whether dyed or russet or halberget, to wit 2 ells within the selvages of weights also let it be as of measures. 2 ells. I'm not sure what an ell is, but I know I like it. Oh, I know what it is. I'm looking at the Latin. Ulna. It's probably like 1 forearm's worth.
Inch is, the end joint on the finger. They measure horses in hands.
Do you know how many stone you weigh?
I do. Wait a minute. I have to do a little math.
How many stone per pound? I forget.
14. Isn't that odd? What odd measurement? I like it.
What stone did they use? I'm over 17 stone.
You are?
Yeah.
Well done. I'm 14 stone 6. Or I'm sorry, 16 stone 6. I like in here about the measurements. I was in England not too long ago, and in Trafalgar Square, there's some bronze marks embedded in the stone there in that square. And it caught my eye. I was like, what the heck is that? And I walk over there, and they're measurement standards. And I've been there. I don't know how long they've been there, but the English people, it's important in that the standards, for trade is so important that at Trafalgar Square, you could go calibrate your rulers, your measures, and so on. And they had a foot, an inch, a yard, a rod, and so on there in Trafalgar Square, if I remember correctly. Big deal. It goes back to this.
Reasonable thing for a government to do. I wonder if John was cheating on the weights and measures.
Putting his thumb on the scale.
Like inflating the currency.
Yeah. How dare you? 38. We'll skip ahead a little bit more. We'll probably leave out some goodies, but no bailiff for the future shall, upon his own unsupported complaint, put anyone to his law without credible witnesses brought for this purpose. Sounds good. Otherwise, the bailiff could just say, you jaywalked. No, I didn't. Is your word against his? He's an officer of the court. You're screwed.
Yep. Need a witness. I thought important was number 40. To no one will we sell, to no one will we refuse or delay right or justice.
There you go.
Noli vendemus. We will not sell to anyone. No money for justice. I think that's a good principle.
I thought 41 and 42 were fascinating.
All merchants shall have safe and secure exit from England and entry to England, with the right to tarry there and to move about as well by land as by water, except in times of war. And if we go to war with the country you're from, they shall be detained without injury to their bodies or goods. If the foreigners treat our merchants safely, then you foreign merchants will be treated safely. So it's making the merchants a bit of a protected class, even in wartime.
They could come to and leave England at their pleasure. So when I read that, I thought, oh, there aren't any citizens. They can't vote. Who cares if they're here? It doesn't change the government one whit if there are a bunch of wool merchants from the Netherlands here. Or whatever. Is that what they do?
Wool merchants in Netherlands, didn't they do?
I don't know.
Flowers, tulips?
Tulip bulbs, pickled herring. I don't know what they do. But there was no talk in here about voting franchises or anything like that because there really aren't citizens the way we think of it.
Are we going to lose the Dutch listeners?
I'm sorry. I think we've got one at Online Great Books. Is that Patrick? Is he Dutch?
Scandinavian, which is not Dutch.
I don't know. They all run together for me.
Yeah. They all speak English anyway, right?
Yeah. Then there's a bunch of stuff in here about the forest laws.
Yeah, I thought that was fascinating too.
Robin Hood is right out of this, guys. Bad King John is a big villain in the Robin Hood. He's the boss at the end of the game. The sheriff of Nottingham is acting as his agent, and Robin Hood is largely bristling against the forest laws. If I remember right, it's been a long time since I read those Howard Pyle Robin Hood stories. Robin's father had his property alienated. And, Robin's father died, I believe, and had his property alienated, and him as the heir, he couldn't get hold of the land, and he goes out in the forest and shoots the king's hart, H-A-R-T, the king's elk, and is in violation of forestry laws, and on and on and on, and ends up becoming an outlaw. the whole time I was reading this, I was thinking about that whole story, well, about all the Robin Hood legends. And right at the end of this thing, there's a list he gives of people that will be pardoned. And he names a bunch of people that were to be removed from office and pretty much run out of town. He named some particular people, and one of them was actually the sheriff of Nottingham at this time.
So what the forests were, they were not just forested land. It was special land for the use of the king, where he could go game hunting. It's like parkland, which I thought was a good way to think of it. It's like national parks that nobody can use but the government without permission. So the king could come in and say, well, that's a forest, that's a forest, that's a forest, now it's mine. And there's special laws in the forest. You might have a town that's in the forest, but now it's under different law. It's not under the common law of everybody else. It's under the special forest law. There's one which says that, this is 47, that all forests that have been made such in our time shall forthwith be disafforested. So John had apparently made a bunch of lands forest, in other words, confiscated it for his private use, that they're saying, no, you can't. This would be like if a government decided that, 98% of the property is now federal land and under federal law. This seems to me what they were doing.
Yeah, I think that's right. And our government does that now. Like, oh, there's a certain moth on that land and you can't use it now. They'll do it now. It's slightly different, but they'll do it now. Yeah, it's in 50, Karl, it says, we will entirely remove from their bailiwicks the relations of Gerard of Athie, so that in future they shall have no bailiwick in England, namely Inglard, Peter, Guy, and Andrew, and so on and so on. But that first name, that Gerard, he was the sheriff of Nottingham at this time.
Huh. Interesting.
Under King John the Bad. I don't know. I'm just imagining that guy was a nasty fellow and had something to do with those legends about Robin Hood.
Yeah. Do we know how much the Robin Hood stuff is true?
I don't think anybody knows.
Robin of Locksley.
Yeah.
I remember, who's the actor that tried to play him and it tried in the beginning to have an English accent and then just gave up in the middle of it?
Was it Costner?
Yeah.
I'm conflicted about Robin Hood. We should read some Robin Hood.
Why are you conflicted?
Because he's a commie. Oh, I don't know about that. Steal from the rich, give to the poor. That whole thing.
No, you're reading it wrong.
Okay.
You're reading it wrong. He's not stealing from the rich.
Mediate this way. Well, that's the line.
No, he's stealing from the government.
Sure.
Ayn Rand had a thing about him.
Oh, boy.
At some point.
Yeah.
I remember reading it in my misspent youth.
Yeah.
That something about how people get the Robin Hood legend wrong.
Yeah.
Were you in love with Maid Marian?
No.
No?
No, I was just in love with that whole lifestyle.
Living in the forest and
just hang out with your bros, little quarterstaff sparring from time to time.
Is it Errol Flynn that had the movies?
Yeah.
The Robin Hood movies?
Yeah.
Those were fun.
So good. No one shall be arrested or imprisoned upon the appeal of a woman for the death of any other than her husband.
Yeah, that's chapter 54, and I had to look that up in McKechnie's commentary that I have that is available on archive for no dollars and no cents. In criminal pleas, what you would have is trial by combat. You wouldn't necessarily get there. There'd be you'd go to court or something, but always behind that is, you've insulted me, sir, and I demand satisfaction, and you're going to fight it out. But nobody fought the women.
Mm.
So when the women make the accusation, you can't challenge her. So she gets a champion to fight you, which could be abused. I wonder who was abusing it.
Isabel? Or the other Isabel?
You look at it and your first impression might be that this is some kind of restriction on the value of the evidentiary declarations of women, maybe kinda, but also when your law is based on the immediate application of physical force and they're not playing on that field, then it might make sense to have some sort of different law for that.
There's a chivalric protection of these women that prevented them from having the same consequences in court for false testimony or whatever that the men would have. That is interesting. No BS fines. That's what number 55 says. We're giving a bunch of property back to the Welsh that he had confiscated. We're giving back hostages to the Scots and the Welsh. And he also says 60. all these aforesaid customs and liberties, the observances of which we have granted in our kingdom, as far as pertains to us towards our men, shall be observed by all of our kingdom, as well clergy as laymen, as far as pertains to them towards their men. Fair enough.
There's going to be one law.
There's going to be one law.
That's another nice bit about civilization, which, it doesn't rise out of the soil. The idea that there is a law that applies to everybody, including the king, is something you have to work for.
And since, moreover, for God and the amendment of our kingdom, and for the better allaying of the quarrel that has arisen between us and our barons, we have granted all these concessions, desirous that they should enjoy them in complete and firm endurance forever. This is the law in perpetuity. Of course, it wasn't.
But there's an enforcement mechanism in that chapter 61. So there's going to be 5 and 20 barons.
Baked in a pie.
5 and 20 barons. So that if we or our justiciar or our bailiffs or any one of our officers shall in anything be at fault towards anyone or shall have broken any one of the articles of peace or of this security, and the offense be notified to 4 barons of the foresaid 5 and 20, the said 4 barons shall repair to us, petition to have that transgression redressed without delay. And if we do not, within 40 days, the 4 barons shall refer the matter to the rest of the 5 and 20 barons, and those 5 and 20 barons shall, together with the community of the whole land, distrain and distress us in all possible ways, namely, seizing our castles, lands, possessions, and in any other way they can, until redress has been obtained as they deem fit, saving harmless our own person and the persons of our queen and children. And when redress has been obtained, they shall resume their old relations toward us. My jaw dropped on this. King John signed this thing saying that if I don't live up to it, you can take all my stuff by force.
Yep.
In other words, how can you read this? This is consent to the governed. In this case, the governed are the barons. And if they don't like it, they are allowed to attack me, as long as they don't kill me or my wife or my kids. And when everything's set to right, we'll resume our old relations. No hard feelings.
I like it. And he abided by this apparently for 1 year.
Yeah. Well, and the barons are the ones who do this because the barons are the ones who can fight.
Yeah. They raise armies for him, for King John.
If government relies on consent of the governed, the consent is given by, how would you take away consent? Well, the barons were going to do it with, soldiers and lances, the arms of the time. That's an interesting bit right there. That I can't believe that. Can you imagine, like a ruler of a modern nation saying, and if you don't like what I'm doing, you may attack me.
Well, they're standing over that guy with a great sword, right?
Yeah.
He signs this. I mean, I'm with Marx on this. This is the only way these things change.
Yeah. Scott Hambrick, Marxist.
I'm sorry. If there's going to be real change, there's always violence in the air, unfortunately.
Yeah. So even that word enforcement, it's enforcement. Mm-hmm. There's force in it. I wish it weren't that way. It's not good feelings that makes people do stuff.
Right.
Eventually, it's having you at Runnymede and handing you the pen and saying, I think you really ought to sign this.
You mean King John the Bad didn't have a change of heart and draft this and signed it and just mail it in a dozen copies?
I don't think so. He had to do it.
No, they had to corner him and make him do it. It's very interesting. This thing is not a riveting read. Unless you're a nerd like me. It's very, very interesting. I think reading it with the knowledge that this is this is a big beginning for us people in the Anglosphere. Makes it more interesting. In reading it, not necessarily like straight ahead for what it says, but thinking about what it must be reacting to. Why did they write that? There must have been something shenanigans going on. Thinking about what it was reacting to, I think makes it a little more interesting, and it's not terribly long. Yeah, 21 pages. I think that's a general principle, by the way, what you just said. When you read something, especially something old that's not in your culture, you might be able to do it better when you're reading something old. Mm-hmm. And you read it and say, well, why did he say that? Why did he do that? That seems strange. At that moment, you stop and you say, well, what's it reacting to? What's the situation that this is dealing with? Presume that the people you're reading are just as human as you are, just as smart as you are, maybe smarter. King John
whoever the head baron was, might be smarter than you and dealing with the situation in the best way possible, and then try to figure out what that way is. And it'll give you a more sympathetic reading, a more understanding reading of this stuff, rather than like we tend to do, which is say, here in the 21st century, we are the wise ones, we are the bright ones. All of this stuff before us is... we are
the culmination of civilization.
Yeah, I was reading this in the gym last night and taking notes in between sets, and people are like, why are you reading Magna Carta? Because it's fascinating. But a lot of people have this sense that anything old, it doesn't apply because all those old people were morons. Well, that's not the case. No, they're not. The civilization that you live in now, where you can see 12-foot tall I-beams, 100-foot long I-beams being carried on like a disjointed truck. Like there's a front end of a truck, and then they put wheels on the back end of it. And it's 5 trucks long. That all of the possibility of this stuff comes from documents like this.
We call those articulated.
Articulated?
Any more Magna comments?
Magna comments. I don't know. It's worth your time. Maybe you could do the highlights. You don't have to necessarily read every bit of it.
Hell, it's not long. Read it all.
It's not long. You might as well read it. The next time you go to a cocktail party, you can cite Magna Carta.
I'm glad I read it. This was the first time I read it, and my imagination just ran wild when I was reading it. I mean, really, the thoughts about King Richard, the Lionheart, and John the Bad, and then Sheriff of Nottingham, and the forestry laws and stuff just was wild.
Here's another aspect to get into it. If you like historical novels, if you want to think what was it like 1,000 years ago or 800 years ago, you can read the legends and the stories, but you're going to get a better picture of what was actually going on by looking at the law code and the property records. Mm-hmm. This is what people were actually doing. The Middle Ages aren't necessarily what you thought they were. And the way to get to what they actually are is to read if you can, is read some original sources, and especially laws, not the romances. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's another online Great Books podcast. I don't love this show. I don't love this one. I don't love this episode.
I think it's got some compelling bits to it.
I hope so. You should read this. And if you got some like junior high kids, they probably ought to read it. And the Articles of Confederation. They're not long. It's not a heavy lift, but there's some really interesting things that you could talk about.
Yeah, I think this is another show that I like better than you liked.
Good.
I think it's going to be good. So, dear listener, you can let us know on the times when Scott and my opinions differ. Who's more right?
This is one time that I hope you're more right than me. By the way, listener, we have a sister show that may already be on the ground at this point. Let's see here. Yeah, this show will be coming out the 12th, March the 12th. March 17th, tune up and tune in to the Music and Ideas podcast. You guys may have remembered the show that we did on Beethoven's Third Symphony with Miss Michelle Hawkins. We did that thing back, let's see, when did we do that? We did that back in February. Well, we're going to be doing a show a whole lot like that one, on all kinds of music with Michelle. We're going to do that twice a month, and it starts the 17th. It's called the Music and Ideas podcast. So go subscribe to that thing and listen along with us. The first show is going to be about the third movement of Brahms' Third Symphony. We haven't recorded that show yet.
We're going to record it in a few hours.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. So, thanks for listening to us, guys. As always, go to onlinegreatbooks.com/OGB podcast and sign up for the VIP waiting list and get some goodies from us there. And go to iTunes, your favorite podcatcher, and sign up for subscribe to the Music and Ideas podcast. It's already out there on iTunes. There's a 0th episode on there. Go ahead and sign up.
You could be the inaugural class.
That's right. And we will talk to you on this show next Thursday.